Computer at the beginning of the show. My name's Noel. Welcome to the Wellbeing Show. I've got a fantastic guest, a returnee. Yeah, people do come back, so they don't get horrified of me and run away and sort of jump off a cliff. Some of them actually come back. So we've got Margaret Ward-Martin with us, who's a fantastic psychotherapist I've known for many years, to discuss issues around narcissistic abuse and narcissism, etc. Before we jump into that conversation, just to remind you, if you're listening to this or watching this even, or both, on the 25th of January 23, around about 9 o'clock British time, it's live. So it'd be great to have you joining in. My number's 07506 319 745 +44. Drop off the first 0 if you're outside of the UK. Drop me a WhatsApp with a question. If you want to, we can maybe integrate you into the show and get you on as well if you've got some things you want to say. If you're listening to this outside of those times and days, then don't call me because I might be asleep. So depending on where you are in the world and where I am in my life, I'm an old man. I sleep at odd times of the day these days, just to survive. So that's it. That's me done. And hello, Margaret. Welcome back. It's great to have you back. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great. And thank you for inviting me back. I was delighted to get the invitation. I'm very well, thank you. And happy 2023.
Yeah. Happy New Year, indeed. So when was the last time you were on? It was post-pandemic or pre-pandemic? It must have been post-pandemic, I think.
It was just at the end of the first, I think it was 21, end of 21, if I remember correctly. And I think we were all still in shock, actually. When we look back, I think we thought that was it. But of course, we went into different phases of lockdown and responses and reactions too.
And the various existential crises of which that one was. I mean, we had the one before that, which was, people might think I'm odd that I'm calling it an existential crisis, but the Brexit vote very much different country and was very stressful and difficult. And then we had the pandemic, which was stressful and difficult. And I have to say, just bloody weird as well.
It is. But all that weirdness, I mean, it assimilated into this, I think this major trauma that and it's all come to a head at once. You know, Brexit kicked in when we needed NHS workers, for example. We needed a surplus of help, and then it was like, where are all our people? Where are the people who are doing these jobs? So exactly. I think it became really sharpened focus of the consequences of one.
Yes. And then, of course, straight on the heels of that, we had that nutter Putin letting loose the dogs of war. And now we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis as a result of all those things. And I'm not alone in arguing, partly as a result of Brexit. I think we are worse off economically because of that, and it's made recovery much more difficult for this country. So there's a lot of stuff that's been going on, shall we say. A lot of and how have you been amongst all of this? How are you surviving?
Good. I think, you know, when we last spoke, I was in the middle of personal situations, which I wouldn't say have resolved. I just found I got through with help of some incredible people, and I'm focusing on new relationships and repairing and rebuilding old ones. And I think that's been gratifying work, really rewarding work. And part of what we'll talk about today is starting with keeping ourselves well and facing up to our own challenges in order that we can be our best selves.
Yeah. I mean, we were sort of talking about the land of therapy, Los Angeles, before the show started. And let's start here, because I think it's interesting. I was on LBC talking about Harry's memoirs, and and not really the memoirs. I haven't read them, so I wasn't really talking about those. But they wanted somebody to come and talk about the issues that have been brought up from a psychological, mental health, or psychological health perspective, and the interviewer asked me very pointedly. I'm going to ask you this question as well. He's sort of the interviewer was Ian Dale, who's I like a lot, actually, his show. And even though we have slightly different visions of the world, but he seems a reasonable person as well. And he was being a bit gammonish in his reaction to Harry, and sort of the opening gambits on the show made me sort of smile wryly. And one of the questions he asked me was, Noel, do you think it's possible to have too much therapy? To which I said, yeah, it's definitely possible. And then I pointed him at the NICE guidelines on treatments and length of treatment, things like that, because these things are thought about a lot in our profession. And in the old days of therapy, back in days when I was a young pterodactyl, as opposed to the old broken one that I am now, people like Freud and Jung and all these people that people have heard of, the movements that came from them would advocate approaches that now I think most of us would be horrified by, which was, it would be common in those practices to require somebody to come to therapy 5 days a week, and do it for many years. I'm sure there are analysts out there who are spitting feathers at the moment at me saying this, but I don't think many of us believe in that stuff now. And actually, most of us would probably think that's quite harmful and dangerous. It's not just not going to be helpful, it's actually going to cause harm to you, that level of dependency. And it's almost like a religious conversion process, and almost like the in some ways, like the topic today, which is about narcissistic abuse. And, in some ways I would say, well, it's probably along those lines, actually. So I'm going to ask you the question, can you have too much therapy, do you think?
It's a great question. And you and I have had many a conversation about the veracity of therapy and therapists. So I think it's also not a quantitative issue, it's a qualitative one. Finding the right therapist might take a long time. And if a client is struggling or in pain and suffering, they might not know what to look for. So I think the profession has an obligation to guide people towards the right type of help. And I could be wrong, call me out if I am, but if you're in long-term therapy, that's a lot of money. So maybe I've grown cynical in my old age, but I think part of our work, I feel it's my work, is to make a clinical guess with supervision as to how long a client will need support. But the objective is to have a good attachment, to have a healthy dependency for them to become independent, and to empower them to be independent, and not feel that if they go against the therapist or do something differently, they'll not cope. So people can have too much therapy, but then I'd look at why a therapist is keeping a client with them for as long as they are.
So would I, to be honest. I think it's really interesting, because these days my sense is that the question, can you have so much therapy, actually breaks down more than just that. But I also think, well, there's different types of therapy for different types of issues. There are different guidelines for what those types of therapies do, because therapy now is better understood, I think, as a series of modalities or approaches. Absolutely.
And because we're dynamic, we might need something in our teenage years, a form of support that we need support, but it will be very different when we've just had our children or when we've lost a parent. I think there are we present differently because we change. And so therefore our psychological and emotional needs change. And I feel that it's important to have that flexibility and understanding and empowerment of the client to say, well, I might look at CBT if that's, but understand what therapies are available and how, where the efficacy is proven or supported with evidence.
Yeah, well, I'm a great fan of evidence-based practice, as you know, but I'm also happy to step out of evidence-based. And I think one of the things I experience is this, that there are certain types of psychological support, which I wouldn't call therapy, but are still psychological, supportive and helpful for some people. And because I also work with rehabilitative models, which are not treatment models. So when you've got long-term issues in somebody's life, just a severe and enduring mental health problem, for example, I don't think the goals are about sorting out that. They're more about other issues in life and how are you psychologically well with a long-term illness, for example. And there's a different question there about
and managing it and it being incorporated, not, you know, it's outside, it's not a separate issue, it's a part of who we are or who one is, and it being more holistic, I feel, rather than, oh, you have therapy for this and it's separate to who you are. And
so let's come back to, I mean, there's two key issues I think you brought up, which I think do link into the notion of narcissistic abuse somehow. And we can maybe look at that and what we mean by that. But there's two issues I think you're touching upon, one of which is accountability. And the other is, and I've just lost that thought, it'll come back to me. But let's stick with accountability for now, in terms of looking at the issue of how, in terms of, you know, dependency, unhealthy dependencies. So accountability and unhealthy dependencies. So dependency as opposed to interdependencies. So thinking about accountability, and I think I'm quite keen on this notion that a mental health professional is accountable for what they do, and not just to the person in front of them, because that can become a justification as opposed to an accountability, but accountable in a broader sense can be held to account to explain what they are doing and why they are doing it. And that seems quite important to me. And then the other issue about, well, what is the goal of the work that you're doing in terms of healthy interdependence? So in terms of healthy interdependence, what's your understanding of it? What do you mean about it? And can you think about that in terms of linking it to some of the key features of narcissistic abuse, which, if you like, do the opposite of that? They create an unhealthy dependency and control, etc.
Right. So there's a lot in there. So in fact, I might need clarification, but and a bit of it. So I think essentially, if somebody has been in a narcissistically abusive situation for a long time, or for many years, or a repeated cycle of narcissistic abuse, might have started with the parents or the system that brought them up, they really don't have a sense of being able to think freely and independently and do what they want. Whatever they do is wrong. So even who they are is wrong. You're stupid, you're useless, you're a waste of space, you know, all these kind of things that could be said, so that the person has no sense of self. So I think part of the work of a therapist who understands this work, the client comes along having no ability to make decisions for themselves. So it's, I think part of the work is identifying who they believe themselves to be. And it might start with, well, I'm stupid, I'm useless, I stayed with them for that long, or if it was a parent, or they said I was hopeless or ugly, or whatever. And then you say, well, that might not be true. So you challenge the beliefs. And then, but it's really important to be able to get them to come to the answers about who they are, not be told who they are by their therapist rather than their abuser.
And why is it important? Tell me why that's important. I think I know.
Otherwise, it's another person. It's another authority figure. And as therapists, where we walk with our clients, we have that privilege. We're not above them. But a part of the healing might be to understand that they have agency and autonomy because they haven't believed that. Right.
And it's interesting because in early therapy, that wouldn't have been the argument at all. So in early therapy models, the models or the early analytical models, I think they've changed, would have argued that the therapist must take a powerful position, get the patient to understand the interpretations, right?
That doesn't, I would agree that it's the therapist's work to help people understand, but I don't necessarily think that has to be a power structure.
Right. So what
hierarchy?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of old analytic models, it definitely was a power structure. So behind the person, you would tell them, you would interpret their thoughts and feelings for them, which to me is narcissistic abuse. I don't think I can see it in any other way, really. And in some ways, that's a sort of that hierarchic model of the powerful person who has the knowledge telling the patient what they are still very much pervades health work, full stop, right?
Yeah.
So we go and get diagnoses from doctors. I mean, in terms of the doctors in mental health or psychiatrists, and not all of them do this anymore, but some still do. And in fact, I've got a patient that somebody did it to just the other day, still seething about it. But you know, there's still that sort of power dynamic, particularly when you go inpatient, for example, somebody's on a ward, and particularly if it's involuntary inpatient, you know, that is actually what's going on. Somebody's making decisions for you. But why do you think it's important, and what is the nature of the power dynamic between therapists and this particular type of situation, and maybe more broadly, I guess?
It's I mean, we talk when we're working together. We'll check out something that's struggling that we struggle with. So, you asked if it was important. What's important about the power? Yes. If there is power, it's the privilege of having the knowledge to convey or instruct. Is that what you mean? Because
what you think the power dynamic is, ideally, in the work we're doing,
in the work that we're doing. Well, as I said, it's because it's a privilege that people come to us. We have to take our work, I think, really very, very seriously and sensitively. And I think that's how we work together in our teams. I think that if there's a power, I don't know if it's a power, it doesn't feel like a power, it's more of a responsibility to help the person understand what their experience is. They're the experts in them. And we have a set of, we have insights. So gently and sometimes really quite carefully explain to them what they might be experiencing, not make the decision for them. You're experiencing abuse, or this was done to you. It has to come from them, I feel. So if there's a power, it's knowing how to do it. It's knowing how to help our clients understand what they've been through, because they may not know that they've been through. They may come with anxiety or depression or a substance abuse issue. But our responsibility, rather than I feel power, is to help to engage with them to say, have you considered that it might be a manifestation of early trauma or childhood trauma? So I hope that's...
It's clear to me, very clear. So the idea is that you're forming a space in which somebody can explore for themselves the meaning, the experience, when they're coming from a background where their voice has been denied. And so there's a difficult sort of challenge there, isn't there?
In that is the power. In that is the power. That knowledge is the power. Giving them that voice is empowering and is the power. And I feel if we do our work effectively, that's where the power, it's felt by our clients. And we are vehicles, we're facilitators with our knowledge and training and our shared, our debriefing and our supervision and our CPD and all the stuff that we do to stay abreast of current thinking, research and learning. But that's where the power is.
Yeah. Okay, I get that. So it's about sort of having a sense of our own power as individuals, not using that to squash people, but making it available so people can use it as a resource to empower themselves.
But that if you are using it to squash people, that's abuse. And that's why I feel in wherever there's any kind of power dynamic, you talked about doctors or police or institutions, wherever there's any power, it has to be checked. You and I know this from direct experience, you ensure that those you work with are kept, we're all kept in check. We share ideas. If we have any struggles, we identify it at source. We then go to supervision. We have group supervision. So it's not that we're policed internally. We also have external police, and then we all work together. But I don't know if every system, structure, or organization has the same. Well, I think we know that they don't have the same checks and balances for power.
Most are hierarchies, and hierarchies have inherent problems. We were talking before the show about whether we move into, and I think now is the time to move into it, look at this issue of power gone mad. People not respecting that they have power over and relishing power over. And we were talking about it particularly in political spheres. And there's obvious examples at the moment of narcissistic abuse. And the most obvious example is what's going on in Ukraine and Vladimir Putin. And we're not diagnosing the guy because neither of us have done the diagnostic assessments of him. But he is clearly, for me, an example of an out of control narcissist who is out of touch and has too much power and too much control and is causing the death of hundreds of thousands of people and has been for decades, actually. So, I mean, I have to say, my camp is I fully support arming and helping Ukraine with whatever they need to stop this insanity. And I'm really grateful and happy that they're given their tanks. I mean, that's where I'm coming from because that's the way it is and it has to be. So, let's talk about that type of narcissism, shall we? What you mean by it and what I might mean by it, and sort of compare and contrast it to sort of how it's talked about in the media. And we can even begin to name people who we think have narcissistic behaviors. It doesn't mean they're narcissists. It's a weird term, isn't it? You're a narcissist. It's become this term that people use. Like, I don't know what. I mean, they're just throwing it around. I don't know what you prefer, but I prefer the term people show narcissistic behaviors or traits. Whether they are narcissist or not is a different matter. But we live in a world that seems to be encouraging traits which I find are fundamentally antisocial. And that's what I think of narcissism as fundamentally antisocial. When it's unhealthy, there's healthy narcissism, but we should say this, like if you don't have narcissism, that when you're born, you won't cry because you won't identify a need and you won't insist that your need is met and therefore you'll die. So there's really healthy narcissism. And that's why I'm really uncomfortable with this term being bandied around. Do you know what I mean?
The simplest way is that some people never grow out of the nappy. They still think if they scream or cry but it's also, it's narcissistic indicators or mechanisms like gaslighting. So, for example, I ask clients, and I invite anybody I'm working with to just say, the biggest tell is between what somebody says and what they do.
Yes.
End of. It's not rocket science. So if you have a government telling you to do one thing and then they do another, if you have an institution, religious, political, police, saying one thing and doing another, that's the biggest red flag.
Okay.
So
really clear way of doing it. Thank you, Margaret. That really nails it. In terms of narcissism itself, because this is the word people use, would you mind just sharing your thoughts on what it is, as an idea and as a pathology and as a health, and just ramble around that a little bit? If I say, what is narcissism? What's your sort of response?
Well, again, we were talking about, we've got the lay person's, like, it's narcissism, which is like taking a selfie. It's not. And not narcissistic personality disorder, as we know in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, is a pervasive pattern of behavior where it's above the law, the rules don't apply, grandiosity, cruelty, sadism, poor relationships, irritability. So that's more the narcissistic personality profile, or the traits.
Pervasive meaning?
It's just all the time, in every way. So they'll be like that with family, be like that with friends, be like that with colleagues. Although,
specific relationships, that's the point. It's not in specific relationships.
No, it's just who they are. It comes out, even if they try and hide it. Remember, it's all about image. Narcissist, it's about that image, which is why what's really interesting about certain types of narcissistic persons is that they hide it with great philanthropy. You know, they'll try to cure the big illnesses, but still go on the Lolita Express. Okay. So there are people who cover up their narcissism with acts of immense universal greatness, finding a cure for malaria. And this is another, it's incredible how it manifests itself in other different ways. Sometimes it's just pure power, like you've explained. It's, I've got the power, I've got the weapons, I've got the arsenal, and people will do what I say. On domestic terms, and I specifically deal with narcissistic abuse. If a client comes to me presenting as, and usually they've read the profile and said, I think something's going on, I can never, as you quite rightly point out, say he or she is a narcissist or they have NPD. We can't do that, partly because the ways of diagnosing require presenting to a team. And if self-report is the only way we can measure narcissism, it's not going to happen. It's like holding water. But the abuse tends to be fairly predictable. So there'll be gaslighting. So people's realities have been doubted. They may be controlled by the money. There may be financial control. They will be lied to. People might meet them, a relative saying, oh, you're nothing like she said you are, or he said you are. There's alienation from children and family. So the narcissist may be with you. You may be living with the narcissist, but she or he will be telling tales to the children about you. Narcissists very often overshare with their children and involve them in their secrets. Don't tell mummy. Yes, the last one is the sanity. I think I'm going mad, and I think I said this on the last time. I hear this sort of, I thought I was going mad. I was imagining things because the person will have left such lies. And of course, there's usually physical abuse, but not necessarily the hitting and I talk about the absence of blood. It could be pushing or shoving against the wall so that it's a restrictive movement, but it's not quite abuse, but you know that you feel like you can't breathe. So there's kind of indicators. Am I talking too much? But
no, that's really clear. That's really helpful. And I just want to say, people are listening and they're in situations where they think it fits this profile, then it's really important not to ignore that and to seek help, talk to professionals about the sort of situation that you're in. Hopefully, and I think one of the things that Margaret is describing, people need to take this very seriously, is how if you're in a controlling and abusive environment, let's use those terms, that controller and abuser may well have created stories about you with people around you. So you have to think about this carefully, about whether the people around you are the safest and best people to go to. In terms of seeking help. If you're a woman, I think you always will find help in any one of the refuge organisations. So Refuge or Women's Aid will understand these issues massively, and James will put out links to them. And if you're a man, there's various organisations that exist, and we'll put links out to them as we go through the show. James will look at the men's support organisations, and you can reach out. It's probably good, I think, I don't know what you think, but I think it's probably sensible to step outside of whatever network, group, personal, interpersonal group that you're in to begin seeking help. Does that make sense, Margaret? Does that fit your...
It does, and sometimes you don't know how far the lies and the decimation of one's reality has gone. So very in the posts or the blogs I write, talk about the long game, so that if you're in a relationship with a narcissist, in innocence, you're just carrying on doing whatever you do to get through the day. But it might years of drip feeding to relatives about you being sick or acting out. She's drinking too much. He's drinking. He's drinking far too much, and they will be getting this impression, because essentially there's going to be a denouement. There's going to be an ending under the abuser's control, where that person is the sick person. So part of the work I do, we talk about rebuilding the person, is part of it is that they have become the sick one in the family. They're overeating, they're undereating, they're hurting themselves, they're down at A&E for whatever reason. So they become the focus of attention. Meanwhile, the abusers stand back and just said, look, I did my best. Look at what I've had to deal with. And her or his family, and certainly the colleagues who are far removed from this situation, may just say, God, what have they done? Yeah. Put up with them for all those years. And it's incredible. I mean, I've just seen it so many times. It's incredibly subtle. And that's what's terrifying about it.
Yeah.
I feel physically frightened by that.
Let's move a bit away from the interpersonal stuff and think about this societal stuff that's going on at the moment, because I do think that there are abuses of power going on in many sectors at the moment. And they are fitting the sort of profile that you're describing on the domestic profile. And I'm wondering, you've mentioned the police. I would say in particular the Metropolitan Police, but then the South Wales Police, there's various police forces now where it's becoming clear that there has been power unfettered without any sort of accountability, which is that word I'm interested in, and has set up a situation in which, in particular, if you're a female in the UK, we've always known that if you were of a certain colour, etc., there were problems for you. You would get differential treatment, but now it's becoming clearer and clearer that some of these power differentials leading to women getting differential and, quite frankly, awful treatment from the police. I mean, what sort of thoughts do you have as a specialist in terms of abuse and particularly narcissistic abuse, in terms of your insights and thoughts around these types of issues?
So just before our meeting tonight, I looked at the headlines and just as an exercise, and I was looking at the headlines were tax evasion by people in power, loans being arranged, the police brutality situation, and then there was a care home where children were abused.
Yes, that was really disturbing.
And I just thought, I get sick. As an individual, feel really quite sick at this being allowed to happen. We had Jimmy Savile those years ago. It's not like, this isn't new. We've had church abuses. This isn't new. At what point is it going to stop? Seems to me it's got worse. Maybe it's post-internet, online porn. I don't know why, but women are, and this is why it's very hard for men, good men, to...
No, it's not hard for good men to hear this. It really isn't.
Well, no, but it's to do. What
it might be difficult for somebody who's fragile and on the sort of edge of being an arsehole, but they're fragile on the edge of being an arsehole.
Because this isn't a woman's problem. Women, I remember last year when it was that awful death of Sarah Everard, and the vigil where our beautiful young women were being pinned down to the ground at a vigil. And I remember feeling scared. This was a police state. It didn't feel like a proportionate reaction to the bending of COVID rules. There was something sinister. And I don't know, when you have something that endemic, what can be done about it? Because somebody's watching this happen. We all watched it. I think it was Priti Patel at the time. It was Home Secretary, but it was, how is it being allowed to happen? I don't know. I just find it shocking. At every single level, it seems that the rot just gets, it's like there's a tighter hold. I can't see where there's an end to this now, because we are outraged every other week with something, but nothing changes.
I mean, the thing about the vigil, and this is one of the interesting historical facts about it, is that the police officer in question who carried out the kidnap, torture, rape and murder of Sarah was already in custody. And so the Metropolitan Police already knew that it was one of their serving officers. They didn't know at that point that he'd murdered her. They were still looking for her, but they certainly had him in custody. He admitted to her sort of kidnap, and yet still they stuck the boot in at that.
That's right. So there's this canteen culture, or there's something going on. Years ago, it must be 20 years ago, I used to teach criminal psychology and to brilliant students at school in West Hatch in Chigwell. And we used to talk about this. There were children from all backgrounds, and they talked about their experiences. And we talked about the police being had to be accountable at some level. And I was, at the time, I think I was sympathetic to the police. A number of the children had parents serving police officers as well, which is why we had such excellent input. But I can't excuse it. I mean, there's something rotten, and it's not a few bad apples, is it? I mean, that story went out with the tide. It's not bad apples. But this institutional misogyny, racism, homophobia.
It is. It's absolutely clear. I mean, it infuriates me. I think the current head of the Met has publicly said it's not a few rotten apples, and has got rid of that myth. The question then becomes how, you're asking this question repeatedly, how does it change? Now, for me, there is, when people ask these questions about public figures in positions of power, probity and correct behavior, and whether that has an impact or not, for me, there's a clear connection between the institutions and what they do in society, whether the leadership of society are setting a cultural tone that enables abuse of power or disables abuse of power. I don't think I'm naive in saying that. I think it's genuinely the case. And if I think about it as a household, working with a household in which either the parents are legitimate in their use of authority and power, or they're illegitimate. Now, if they're illegitimate in their use of power, the whole household will be infected by that.
Absolutely.
You'll see in all the children unhealthy survival strategies just to somehow get through. Mm-hmm. And get through that situation in which there's actual dependencies in terms of needing food, needing shelter, needing clothing, needing getting to school and all that sort of stuff. And then the adult that emerges from that environment, their psychology, their way of operating in the world is distorted, damaged, and actually damaging to others. Mm-hmm. And so I think about it in those terms, really. Mm-hmm. That if you have significantly distortions of power at the top, and this doesn't happen overnight, it's sort of not something, it's not just one person, it's a culture of something that either creates below it unhealthy survival mechanisms or healthy interdependent mechanisms where people understand there's rules and there's consequences, they accept them, it's predictable, it's understandable, they're attached, they believe in the bigger project, etc., etc., etc. And it seems to me that currently we're in a situation that fits that distorted abusive household model more than the healthy family.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's also moral injury.
Yeah. Explain that. What do you mean by that?
So moral injury is when something awful happens. There's a behavior, in my understanding, is there's a behavior that's performed by somebody. Say, for example, there's a terrible racist slur in the office and somebody calls somebody a racist or a sexist term and it's offensive to the individual. They then have a choice. They then have a choice to question that person and run the risk of speaking truth to power, or they say nothing. And sometimes, not always, thankfully, but sometimes it becomes the norm. And this new norm where racist slurs are banter or sexist slurs are banter, so then it's normalized. And it's the same with families. And I love the analogy, brilliant analogy, that if you have people, the parents committing some kind of disrespect or contemptuous act, or even expressing a contemptuous attitude towards women or people of color or people with different sexuality, then, and you'd say nothing, then you somehow assimilate that into your norm.
Yes.
And have I misunderstood? If I've explained that badly, please tell me.
That seems very reasonable to me. I understand that, yeah. And morals, of course, morals being our internal guiding principles that have determining action, right?
That's right. So the simple one is, would you like to be treated like that? It doesn't have to be religiously inspired, although Judeo-Christian our legal system is informed by Judeo-Christian principles. But this is just, would you like to be treated like that, or would you like your children to be treated like that? And generally speaking, it's binary. So I think that when you have parents perhaps being creative with their taxes, then, well, it legitimizes, well, you know, my parents did it, so I'm going to, or they're going to. But I remember years ago, and I'm just thinking on my feet here, the Nolan's Principles of Public Service, or whatever.
That's right.
Yes, yeah. So what happened there? Yeah. Because when I was a school governor, I think it was 3 days of inset. It was essentially what's happened. Because I was told, and this is what assured me, is that all our public servants would read the same and have the same education around accountability to those we serve.
Yeah. It's interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking about, because I've been around a while, and I'm thinking about sort of historical figures in politics going back some time. So I think about Margaret Thatcher, who in no way was a pleasant person. I don't think we would on any level, but I would never have. I even to this day, I don't think she was immoral, and she was difficult, irascible, challenging. I disagreed with her on so many things. I think some things she was right, but she always seemed to do it in a very aggressive and confrontational manner, which I find unpleasant and unnecessary, but whatever. But I can't imagine I can't think of her as a corrupt, morally corrupt person. That she had her beliefs, I disagree with them, but I think she genuinely held them, right?
But
And I don't think necessarily she was out just for herself, whereas I think this mob are.
But it's also what the story people tell themselves, because I was up at uni, I think, during Thatcher's premiership, and the way that the miners were treated, and, you know, that awful things, not directly, it's indirectly, that some awful things happened on her watch. So I kind of agree, but I also think that people say, I'm doing it for the, listen to, I mean, we were talking about Trump. Listen to the story that he tells himself, or to any, you know, even who else?
I guess I'm not saying, I hear what you're saying about, because I do think she was quite brutal, particularly around mining.
Mm-hmm.
And it was unnecessarily brutal. And undoubtedly, the way those communities were destroyed was systematic. There was direction behind it. But it seems different to me to say what Trump is doing, or even what current leaders of the government are doing. In that, yeah, I think she was justifying the ends justify the means would have been the
That's right. That's right. But I also think it's a belief system, was it? And groupthink and bias, you know, confirmation bias, and seeking out like minds. And it's just an observation on my part, no judgment. It's just having a look at events and what the power, and I think again we come back to those in power said at the time were their motives, and it's plausible, very, very plausible. And that's what I learn. That's all I'm doing. I learn, and I want to know more about what I do. And the more I study and the more research I conduct, the more these patterns emerge as really quite obvious. And the latest, as I said, and I think this is really interesting, the great philanthropists, possibly through history. What was the cover story? What was it? What was underneath? What was going on? Are they some are purchasing their place in heaven? That's narcissists are terrific, or people with narcissistic traits are terrific at smoke and mirrors. So they'll take the attention over there, and they'll be getting on to with whatever. So those who are doing great things and being at Davos and changing the world were also involved with Jeffrey Epstein or the likes. I'm not, maybe I shouldn't be speaking like that.
No, it's reasonable to talk about these things. And a classic example, you've mentioned him already, was Jimmy Savile, for example. Which, I mean, it was absolutely 100% clear that he was using that cover of being a philanthropist to get access to his victims. And then to keep people silent, and sort of, he was in a powerful position. They're not going to believe you, they're going to believe me, because I've raised millions for charity. And there was nobody else who you can think of who would have been allowed to wander around wards, unfettered, checked, etc., and all this sort of stuff. So it's absolutely right. That's what they do. And that's partly why in health and social care, we have these things called DBS, sort of, we have background checks on people now, rigorous, automatic, nobody escapes them. And because we know that flies are attracted to shit.
Yeah.
The way it is. And so you watch behavior. But it's interesting. I wonder, what would a DBS for somebody joining Parliament look like, for example? Do you know, what would be the exclusions that would bar somebody from attending or being in a public position? Because what you're saying is the tendency is to seek positions that allow you to behave in morally corrupt ways.
Well, to essentially affect policy around it. It's lobbying for moral decrepitude. Could be, they allowing things because that allows you to indulge, for example.
Yeah. Do you think it's inevitable that somebody who goes into those types of positions is corrupt narcissistically in that sense and is looking, do you think it's inevitable or is it avoidable?
And that's such a good question. You'd like to think not. I think there's some fantastic politicians doing really good work. God knows how they cope and they manage to keep themselves intact. If you've got some of the language you hear, I mean, even foul language, for example, becoming a norm. So if the F word, every other word is the F word, that is an assault. That is violent language. The C word, all of the words that we have been led to believe are commonplace in our places of power. And how do you say that? This I find really offensive. Don't speak like that. It hurts me. It offends me. And then you're not thick-skinned enough. So I think there's a way of natural selection that people who really are trying to maintain some kind of moral integrity have to be bloody minded to survive, but can't be unaffected by it.
Yeah, and go situations shape ourselves. Like I think about when I first started in this phase of my career, which is setting up the company and stuff like that. I was a different person to the one I am now. Without a doubt, it has shaped me, and I sort of have different ways of relating to people now than I did then, without a doubt. So we can't avoid the fact that our personality changes, but does that mean our core moral beliefs need to be injured and damaged is the question.
That's right. Well, our personality does change. I think the latest thinking, and you probably know much more than I do on this now, but that Eysenck and Cattell and this personality, fixed personality, it's not necessarily true. Things happen. We change.
It's a neurological fact. We can't avoid it.
We change. We become different people. We learn. We rebuild. We rebirth several times. If given the impetus and opportunity and the will to do so. So I think part of it
is not coming from the frontal lobes. I mean, we know that.
Yes. Yeah.
So what change, and that's because that's a useful adaptive survival skill as a human, isn't it? You learn new stuff in new environments. If you don't learn them, you die out. I mean, that's it.
Right. That's right. We adapt to survive.
The gut reaction, and I'm talking about the disgust reaction, which is linked to politics and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
That can and does change. And it's one of the things that changes in terms of narcissistic abuse, for example, is that one of the methods of narcissistic abuse is what you said, this grooming effect, where you learn to tolerate, you are taught to tolerate the intolerable.
But that's part of the work we have to do in recovery. Anybody in recovery looking to heal needs to be mindful of that darkness and shine the light on it. Because if they've tolerated it, the chances are that they've displayed those behaviors themselves.
Yeah,
it might be to.
So then, coming back to the lesson here about the political system, why is it we don't tolerate this? It's because it directly has an impact upon us as individuals.
That's right. In
terms of it grooms us into an acceptance of what should not be accepted, and it shifts us. And I don't know if politicians do know the link between gut reactions and political belief systems. They probably. I doubt if they do, to be honest. I'm not particularly a conspiracy theorist, but that's the truth.
Yeah.
Is that you make the intolerable tolerable to somebody, and then it's very difficult to make that change. The personality is relatively straightforward to change, but that disgust mechanism shift is very difficult.
Yeah.
And so not done easily or lightly, and it happens usually over a long period of time. Which maybe comes to your question, is there any way out of it? I think there is. I mean, I'm always a glass half full person. Sort of. I'm Irish, so it's a genetic thing. I can have no choice but to be optimistic within the horror, because that's built into me. So I think it is possible to get out of it. But I think we should not be naive about the amount of time it's going to take, because there is a rot in this country at the moment, a deep rot. And it's going to take a significant amount of work in terms of the sort of psychic healing that needs to take place. And that's not about policy. It's just not acceptable. I heard a school teacher, head teacher, did a blog in a school not long ago where she was advising her students, the girls that come to a school, not to approach a lone male police officer. It's extraordinary. And she was questioned by the press, who said, police. She said, I'm not attacking the police, but I'm equipping my girls for the realities of our society. And that's the truth now at the moment. And I think we do need to ask ourselves, how in God's name are we in that position where it is wise, and it is wise, to advise young women not to seek help from a lone male police officer? That's extraordinary that we are there. There's nothing enlightening about that. That's a sign of deep problems in society.
Sadly.
Yeah, it's real, real shocking stuff, but that's where we are.
I think I'm mindful of the time. I think one of the things that I feel is important is, rather than the defensive position being taken by anybody who is exposed like this, is to find the courage to change, find the courage to soul search and be a better version of themselves. Because individually, the police are responsible. Each individual police officer is responsible for their decision, in the same way that each individual politician is, or therapist, or parent. We've got to take individual responsibility for the outcomes. And I think then collectively there's a chance of change.
Yeah, and I think we have to move to good parenting again. Essentially, that's it for me. Adults in the social sense, anybody in an adult position, a therapist, a police officer, a politician, a business leader, whatever, anybody who's taking that role needs to think carefully about what is a good parent.
Well, it's really interesting that my thinking is that, well, maybe there was a lack of good parenting in there.
I think that's where I would challenge that, and I would challenge it, because I think that's the old model of thinking. I think that what we have at the moment are people responding to decades of rot, and their personalities and their moral systems have shifted because of that, and we have to take responsibility for that and move it back. It's an current environmental, psychological environmental, not world environmental or green politics, but it's
societal.
It's understanding. It's not because of shitty things that happened in your past. Shitty things happened in my past. That doesn't stop me from making moral, decent, human, passionate decisions, right? I took responsibility for myself, got the help. I was lucky enough to get the help, and then I act upon that help. And that's available. Okay, maybe not to everybody, and I'm not going to blame people for shitty things that have happened, but that's old model, regressive model, the sort of, the post-analytic model. You've got a disordered attachment, therefore that explains why. It doesn't. We know attachments can be healed.
That's right. And I think that's really interesting. She said that that's why there is so much available for free for people to educate. In the absence of affordable therapy, there is so much information on the internet, good, credible, it's important to screen, but such good information to help people understand their own suffering.
Yeah. Okay. We are at the end of time. Really fascinating conversation. Thanks, Margaret. Really good to have you here. If people want to find out more about you and get hold of some of your services, because I know that you do one-to-one work, but you also do groups, and you're doing
leaning towards retreats, and workshops. That's in formation at the moment.
So where can people go to get more information and maybe get hold of
website, the Grace Project.
The Grace Project.
All on that website. Please.
James will put that out. And I should say, although Margaret and I have known each other for ages, that's not why I have her on. It's not a nepotistic thing. It's because I think the work you're doing, I know that the work you're doing is very, very high quality. It's very effective for people. It's also quite niche, I think, in many ways, and quite unique what you're offering. And there's something about you as a human being which is very healing, and very kind and compassionate and gentle to people who've had the shit kicked out of them psychologically. So it's like,
oh, thank you. No, I really appreciate you being able to see that, and the value of the work, and for encouraging me. You're seminal in that, so thank you.
So thank you for being with us again, Margaret, and thanks everybody for this tonight. And I'll see you all again next week when I've got a guest. I think his name is Mark. That's as much as I know, because I was reading the email today and I've forgotten already who Mark is, but I'm sure he's great. So bye-bye for now. You stay there, Margaret. Bye-bye for now, and I'll see everybody again next week.